The early Presbyterians believed in separation of church and state, but they also believed that the state should be Christian. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. So today is an important day because I'm finally finishing the journey back to my original Presbyterian church that I built on this Christian Minecraft server. I built St. Athanasius Presbyterian Church, but it got hijacked by the villagers who worship the pink sheep, so I retreated and I went to the middle of nowhere and tried to start a new church, but it wasn't nearly as good. So now I'm going to take back my original church. Just like a lot of Christians are trying to take back America. We're seeing a rise in people talking about Christian nationalism, and then other Christians saying, oh, we shouldn't do that because there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, and Christians shouldn't be political, and then the left-wing media saying, oh, it's all fascist, these Christians are being fascist. So it's an important question. Should Christians be involved in politics, and if so, how much? Does that mean we need a theocracy? Does that mean we're going to go back to the ages of the Puritans? What does that mean exactly? Should Christians be involved in politics? So I made another video in the past about the idea of separation of church and state, because this idea, this phrase, is completely misunderstood. Presbyterians came up with the idea of separation of church and state, but what they meant by that was not that the state shouldn't be religious. They did not mean the state should never make laws based on religion. They meant that the church and state should be separate institutions and not really interfere with each other, but both of them should be Christian. They should be two separate Christian institutions, two different things that are both in covenant with God. That's why the 1600s Presbyterians were called the Covenanters. So that is the ideal Presbyterian political theology. We're not Anabaptists. A lot of the Anabaptists during the Reformation wanted to not be involved with secular politics at all because they're like, oh, God's kingdom is not of this world. But Presbyterians were like, yeah, it's not of this world, but it colonizes this world. It has an influence on this world, and God is king over everything. But they still believed in a two kingdoms theology, that God reigns over the church and the secular world in different ways. So both of them should submit to Christ, but they're not necessarily the same institution. That's what we meant by separation of church and state. So I already made a video about that. But unfortunately, since neither Trump nor Kamala Harris had a Presbyterian theocracy as one of their political platforms, sadly, we have to wonder how we're supposed to be involved in a country where nobody really is trying to install what we want. How politically involved should Christians be in a country that's increasingly secular? Now, a lot of these big evangelical pastors will say, oh, Christians shouldn't be involved in politics at all. A lot of Tim Keller's followers say this. Not Tim Keller himself. Tim Keller himself was a lot more conservative than a lot of his followers. But a lot of the Kellerites or the John Piper-esque people will say, separation of church and state, it's not the church's job to win the culture war, it's just the church's job to save individual souls and then let the Holy Spirit convert the hearts of individual people. Now, obviously, that is the church's job, but is that the church's only job? I don't think so. I think the church should be politically involved. I don't think it contradicts separation of church and state for the church to advocate for the state to uphold good morals. And how do you know what good morals are? I mean, there is natural law. You can just use reason in some sense, but it's not wrong for the government to make laws based on the Bible. Now, this isn't theonomy. I'm not a theonomist, because theonomy is a very specific position that's actually very, very new, which says that the Old Testament law should be the basis for civil government in some sense, and, none of the reformers believed that. John Calvin explicitly rejected that view. But that doesn't mean the Bible can't be used for moral principles in terms of the government. So I think Christians should be politically involved. I think it's very important. Why? If we really believe that Christ is king over everything, that includes not just our personal lives, that includes the entire world. And if we believe that Christ is king, and that Christ is a good king, then it is actually loving to our neighbors to advocate for Christian principles in the public sphere, in government. I feel like a lot of Christians are ashamed of their own faith. I feel like a lot of Christians feel like, oh, if I sort of forced Christian values on the outside world, that wouldn't be very loving of me. Why not? Don't you think Christian values are loving? Isn't it loving to not want to kill a bunch of babies through abortion? Isn't it loving to advocate for, law and order, which the Bible demands, and not let criminals roam the streets freely? Isn't that loving? So, if you're not ashamed of your faith, if you really believe that biblical principles are not just what we personally, individually decide to follow, if you really think that they're objectively good, if you really think that they're from an objectively good God, why shouldn't we advocate for biblical principles in the public square? So what I think we need to do is we need to normalize Christians advocating for Christian values in the public sphere. And that is the Presbyterian view of things. Presbyterians, the Scottish Presbyterian Covenanters, who wrote the Westminster Confession, they all believed this. They all believed that the state needs to submit to Christ. Now, some of the more extreme Presbyterian Covenanters, the RPCNA, the Reformed Presbyterian Church of America, they don't believe that Christians should even vote in America. I'm not sure if they still have that view. They did historically. They believe that Christians shouldn't even vote in America because our nation doesn't explicitly submit to Christ. Now, not all Presbyterians have been that extreme, but it just shows the Presbyterian principle is that our nation, as a nation, must submit to Christ. It's not that we individually submit to Christ, but our nation can just submit to vague principles of freedom and democracy. Now, there was the First Amendment in the Constitution, but that was actually called the Baptist Amendment by the Presbyterians because they thought it was based on Baptist political theology to say that the government should not have any sort of dealings with religion at all. I'm not saying, we should have like a new government or a new constitution. I think we are called to work within the bounds of the society that we're in right now. But I still think that does not preclude Christians from advocating for biblical morality in the government, in the secular government. Now, we think the word secular means bad. No, secular doesn't mean bad, and that's something that the Calvinist tradition really emphasized. The Calvinist tradition did separate church and state. It said that, the public square is not sacred, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be involved in it. The difference between, the Catholic view of the culture and the Calvinist view is the Catholic view that wants to make everything sacred. And there's a good argument for that. If Christ's kingdom extends to everything, then everything should be made more sacred. That's why Catholics have, holy water, holy relics, holy places, holy everything. Whereas the Calvinists was no, strictly only the church and the word and sacraments, that's the only thing that's actually sacred. But we should make the secular world Christian. So the Calvinists adopted more of a positive view of the secular world, but secular is not actually the opposite of Christian. I want people to understand that. Just because something's secular doesn't mean it can't be Christian as well. It means it's not specifically sacred. It's not dedicated to the worship of God. It doesn't have to do with the church. But just because it doesn't have to do with the church doesn't mean it's irrelevant to Christianity. So the Calvinist principle was to make the secular world better. That's why in historically Calvinist countries like Switzerland and the Netherlands, everything just works well. Even though they've abandoned the Calvinist principles they were founded upon, the trains arrive on time in Switzerland because of the Calvinist principle of punctuality. A Dutch Calvinist invented modern clocks because Calvinists were so focused on making the secular world better and so focused on God's sovereignty over all things, they literally invented our modern notion of punctuality. And in 2020 with all those, liberal revolutions, they said that the notion of punctuality is a Western Christian imperialist idea. They're not wrong about that. I just think it's a good thing. They're not wrong that, Western Calvinist Protestant Christians invented the standards of being on time and hard work, and that's what Western civilization is built on. They're not wrong about that. I just think that that's a good thing. And I think that these same Calvinist principles should be enforced all across our country, especially because the founding fathers of America were very influenced by Presbyterian principles, because the phrase that inspired the American Revolution was Lex Rex, or rule of law. Who coined the phrase Lex Rex? It was the Presbyterian scholastic Samuel Rutherford, who was a great theologian, probably the best theologian of the Westminster Assembly. He helped write the Westminster Confession. So, if you're a Christian, no matter what denomination you are, you should be involved politically. But, especially if you're Presbyterian, there is no excuse not to be. If you're Presbyterian, and you subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, you should have the same beliefs as the people who wrote that Westminster Confession of Faith. You should be advocating for your country, whatever your country is. I know my audience is like mostly American, but whatever your country is, you should be advocating for that country to submit to Christ, because Christ is king, and Christ is king over all the nations. So if you're an American, you should advocate for America to officially submit to Christ, not just individuals in America, obviously we need that too, but also America collectively should submit to Christ. America collectively should be in covenant with Christ, just like Scotland was in the 1600s. And that's what transformed Scotland from muddy, dark backwater to one of the most advanced civilizations in the world. And Scotland has only started to degenerate because, once again, it's abandoned the Calvinist principles that it was founded upon. And looks like I am finally back in Borealis, the original Presbyterian town on this Minecraft server. I'm back in Borealis, so now it's time to begin taking back my church. It's going to be long and hard, obviously, according to the lore. In reality, I'm making all this stuff up. You guys know that. But it's a nice symbol of how we should not run away from the institutions and the countries that Christians of the past have built. Because, you know, this retreatist mindset of just running away from the culture and running away from the institutions, that's what a lot of conservatives have done lately. But we can't do that, especially not if you're Presbyterian. Especially not if you want to be faithful to our covenanting forefathers in the Presbyterian Church. Okay, I am back at St. Athanasius Presbyterian Church. It's still run by the Pink Sheep, but we're not going to give up trying to take it back.